From WXCI 91.7 in Danbury, this is Public Reading Club, a radio program dedicated to discussions about books, writing, reading with writers and book people. Your host is Matt Caputo.
Thanks for joining us again on Public Reading Club, a radio show and podcast about books, writing, book people, and everything in between. I'm Matt Caputo. I'm your host. It's great to be here again. I'm really excited about this episode. I'm really not going to waste too much time here at the top of the show. Our guest today is Ian MacAllen, whose book, Red Sauce: How Italian Food Became American, is just a fascinating read about basically the intersection of Italian and American food and their cultures. It's a really cool book if you like food and if you like really one of the most popular types of cuisine in the world, but especially here in America, where it's been adapted and it's been used in so many different interpretations. He's our first guest. He's a fantastic writer, journalist, and it's great to have Ian MacAllen visiting with us on this episode of the Public Reading Club. Also joining us will be Erik Ofgang, who is a teacher here in the WestCon MFA program, and he's a fantastic writer who's written several books, but also is a pretty active freelance writer who comes up with some great stories. And he has a very interesting story about a sideshow kind of magician who influenced the great science fiction writer Ray Bradbury. And it's really going to be, if you've enjoyed this show so far, I dare to say that this might be one of our most fun episodes. Ian's book is fantastic, and Erik's article is great. Incidentally, it gives me the opportunity to bring up the idea that I didn't want to just make this show exclusively about books. I love books. I read a book or two all the time at the same time. And I, wanted to create a platform to talk about them, but I also wanted to create a show where we encourage people to check out really good long-form pieces, magazine articles, stuff posted to websites that have been well done and well researched. So long-form journalism, I guess you could say, is another interest of mine, and I guess you could say it's another interest of the Public Reading Club. So it's really great to have both Ian and Erik on the show. We're also going to release to you a voicemail that came in via recommendation from a gentleman named Eugene Keogh, who may or may not have been, as they say, 3 sheets to the wind when he submitted said voicemail. But I want to thank him for his recommendation. So stay with us here on 91.7 WXCI WestCon Radio here in Danbury, Connecticut, as we go to the 4th episode of Public Reading Club. You've all been great. We've been growing just a little bit on Instagram and social and stuff like that. I want to thank Peter Blauner for coming on our last show. It was really a fantastic episode. If you want to go back and check that out, we're on Spotify and everywhere podcasts are available. You can hear the show. We're also twice a month on WXCI Sunday mornings at 7:30 a.m. So it was really great to have these two great writers in. We have a really fantastic writer on the horizon. I'm not allowed to say who it is or what book they sent me in the mail, but all I can say is we have a great crime fiction legend coming to the Public Reading Club soon, and I'll get that episode to you as soon as we tape it. So I'd like to thank Pat Fournette, our engineer and producer, for always being here and making this show work as smoothly as it has, and for the great edit he did on the last show with Peter Blauner, who's a fantastic guest. Without further ado, please check out our interview now with Ian MacAllen, author of Red Sauce: How Italian Food Became American, and then stick around for later in the show when we have Westcon MFA professor and just prolific writer and journalist Erik Ofgang on the show, as well as a special book recommendation from you, the listeners of the Public Reading Club. Welcome back to the Public Reading Club. Our guest today is writer and book critic Ian MacAllen. He is the author of Red Sauce, How Italian Food Became American, out now from Rowan and Littlefield. Ian, thanks for making the trip from Brooklyn today. How was the ride up on the train?
It was great. I mean, this was my my first time riding the New Haven line to on the Metro North, which is actually an aspiration of mine to have done. I've done the other Metro Norths and Long Island Railroads and New Jersey Transit. So you've helped check off a box for me today.
All the way to the end, huh?
First time taking the train all the way to Danbury. I had to transfer, which was an interesting experience because you had to go up and over, and the train coming in was late. So I was like, are they going to hold it for me? And then I realized, they were holding that train for my train. So I was probably pretty good.
This brings up a story in my past that I guess this would be an opportune time to share. It's pretty eerie, and I guess there's a sensitivity warning that there's an accident in the train accident about to come. But one time when I was an undergraduate student at Westcon here, very briefly 20 years ago, I took the train back home from here, and I eventually crossed over, and we got down, and we were right near Mamaroneck. And I remember I was reading a book, actually. Good thing I can remember. I was reading a book of all articles about Mike Tyson. It was called Iron Mike, and it was a collection of articles about Mike Tyson. And there were two ladies behind me, and they were being very, very chatty and loud. And the train was moving pretty fast. And then I remember the sound. This is kind of a weird thing to get into at the top of the show, but I remember the sound of the kind of conductor coming over the loudspeaker to say, "Did we hit him? I think we got him," the other guy says. And they stopped the train, and they asked us to get off the train because we had struck a pedestrian that ran on the tracks. We get off the train, and I'm still in shock because this is what I'm hearing. And then the two chatty ladies that were on the train, who were now in front of me exiting, one of them fell to her knees, and I couldn't figure out what the hell happened. But what she had seen was the sight of the remains of this person, which was only their leg from the knee down, and a Reebok sneaker and a white sock. Unfortunately, it was really just kind of eerie moment. But I think whenever you go on a train, because it's just such a unique way of transportation, and the movies over the years there's always a story that takes place on them. I kind of feel like there's always inspiration.
Well, I always think of the train scenes in films where people are running alongside the train, and usually they jump on without a problem, but occasionally they slip under.
Yeah,
and that's always on my mind when you're seeing that train come by.
And I remember my dad. I guess there was a Hudson News there or something like that in Grand Central when I used to travel back and forth just for that 1 year before I went to Purchase. He got a copy of one of the Paul Auster books. And the Paul Auster book, it was either part of the book or a story where he was at the very track my dad was standing at in Grand Central Station in the book. So there's always these weird little things that happen by train. You said something. What was the scene at Grand Central like?
Well, I got to the station a little bit early because I didn't want to miss the train connecting to Danbury. And that gave me the opportunity to see the brand new Grand Central platforms from the Long Island Railroad, which, I will admit I'm kind of a train buff. When they opened the Moynihan station at Penn Station in the middle of the pandemic, I took the opportunity to wander around that.
That was really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the building that Moynihan's in is gorgeous because, same vintage as the original Penn. Not the Penn that's there now, but and then just see how they modernize that into in a way that, they don't have any benches. I didn't see any trash cans. But other than that, it's a very nice space. And then the same thing in the new Grand Central. No benches and nowhere to throw out trash. And very, antiseptically white.
Yeah.
And New York has built a lot of big new train stations in the last few years. I'm thinking of the World Trade Center at the Path, the Fulton Transit Center. And I think the challenge in all of these spaces is the economizing of the construction. They want to have these grand, beautiful spaces, but then the low bid contractor comes in and kind of cheapens what the result is.
What can be in many cases. I like the Moynihan Station. My mother goes through it when she travels to D.C. to see my brother. So I've picked her up from there a few times. The restaurants are cool. It's definitely. What'd you have for breakfast today, Ian?
Come on. I was planning on getting a bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich from a bodega. But I came across a black seed bagel shop in Grand Central. Ooh. And I do like a good black seed bagel. And normally, there's not any by my house. And so, normally if you go out on a Saturday and Sunday, there's a big long line. But at 10 o'clock in the morning on a weekday, it was pretty easy to go in there and grab a bagel and eat that on the train on the way up.
I wanted to talk to you. You were probably supposed to be my very first guest. When I came up with the idea for this show, and we just never got there. We're here for episode 4. It's exciting. Your book came out, I guess, about a year ago, right?
Almost exactly. You're coming up on the 1-year anniversary, which is also my son's second birthday, or it will be his second birthday. And it's interesting because I'd been talking to my agent about getting the book contract when it first happened, and then my wife goes into labor, and a couple hours later, baby comes out, and then a few hours after that, I get in my email a contract for the book, and I wrote back, I'm gonna have to get back to you in a few days because we just had a baby, and a year later, the book came out, and now my son will forever have to share his birthday with the book. So,
I wanted to talk about it, especially because I love how much secret truth and hidden nuggets of kind of history and Americana are in this book. Red Sauce, How Italian Food Became American, again, which is out. It's been out for a while by Rowan and Littlefield. One thing I wanted to ask you is, in terms of the book, it's hard to know where to start. It's very dense, like a lot of my favorite books. It's very dense, and there's a lot of reading that gives you it gives you a route that you might not have normally gotten to on your own in a lot of ways. What are the roots of this book for you, this book project?
Well, it's interesting you talk about the density of the book. A lot of it for me was I was reading things at little snippets, and they weren't telling the full story. So I was really working hard to try to find the full narrative there so that no one felt that they didn't get the full story. And so that really comes back to the first imagining of this book, which happened with my wife and I. Were eating dinner at a red sauce joint she'd been going to since she was a kid in the West Village of New York. We're a little bit drunk on a little bit of house red wine. It comes in a big carafe, and so it's a little bit more than a bottle. So between two people, you're getting pretty toasty. And I had the question was posed of essentially, where is all this food actually originating from? Because we're both Italian American heritage, but we'd also both moved to Italy, and so we knew that the food that we had grown up eating and that we were eating in that restaurant was not at all represented in Italy today. And so the question that I had was it at one time Italian? Was it something that came from the immigration process, the experience of melting together? And who invented it and why did it happen? And I wasn't finding the answers. I got home that night and I started Googling, again, a little tipsy, so my Googling may have been sloppy. But and then I went to the Strand in New York. I bought a couple books, and they had partial answers. There was like, this thing might come from here, but then they didn't have anything else either way. And then finally I got to the New York Public Library, which I'm very grateful for the research access that they provide at the public library there. But at that point I was like, I'm doing so much research here. I'm taking notes. This is really the beginning of a book project, or some kind of writing project, and then it kind of evolved into a full-length book.
Well, that's something that I was going to ask you about. Did you sit down and write this book, or did you keep extensive notes and start to put little things together?
Well, once I decided that I wanted to turn it into a book project, that then I was trying to organize that information, and it was a challenge because you have the idea of sauces, right? So it really started out as like things you put on pasta, right? But then it evolved into the right. So
it's
like
a beautiful idea.
Yeah, and so from there it evolved into like, well, okay, you can go to a red sauce joint, so to speak, the sort of typical Italian American restaurant from the mid-century, where red checker tablecloth, bottle of Chianti in a straw bottle, breadsticks on the table, that sort of thing. And that's a pretty standard kind of menu across the country, right? And so I was like, what are those other items on there? And then you get to chicken parmesan, you get to, going back 100 years ago into things like fra diavolo, lobster fra diavolo, which now is often either seafood, generally, not just lobster, or shrimp diavolo. And so all of a sudden I was like trying to organize these notes. I distinctly remember the challenges of creating a file structure, right? Like, do I do it by sauce? Do I do it by year? And initially, the original book was conceived of from a standpoint of recipes. So organized by type of sauce, type of cooking, lasagna, pizza, parm, and then the first draft that evolved from that wasn't really telling a story. It was more like a lot of short articles that were tangentially connected because they were all related to the idea of the red sauce joint, but didn't really have a through narrative. And so actually an agent who I had submitted a query to had read that draft of the manuscript, and she had some suggestions on, she was like, I can't represent it the way it is now. But if you reconstruct it into more of a linear narrative, that might give it the cohesion it needs. And, your first thought is, oh no, she's wrong. And then you have that moment of like, oh, maybe she's not. What if I try it out?
Right. This has happened to me for sure. I'm in the middle of something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm going along, I'm start reconfiguring it. And now all of my file structure makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because I've originally put all the research and notes based on the type of food rather than by the year the food came about, or came to America, or became part of that red sauce tradition. And so now I had to reorganize all those notes, and then on top of that, reorganize the manuscript. So there's a lot of cutting a piece of it, putting it back together in a new way, and then finally there was the narrative did evolve of how we went from the late 19th century with the first of the immigrant wave beginning in the 1880s of Italians coming here, and how that evolved into them having restaurants and why they started having restaurants. And then the story of why those restaurants needed to start appealing to more than just Italians, and how that then influenced the foods. So like chicken parm is essentially or a veal parm is essentially a cutlet of meat that's been fried and covered in sauce and cheese. But what was happening at the same time that evolved is in the United States, German restaurants were very popular. And what do German restaurants have? They have a schnitzel, right?
Right.
And so what is a parm but a schnitzel that has been covered in tomato sauce, which comes from the southern Italian traditions, has a rich, big chunk of cheese on it, which really is an evolution of the access to those kind of calories in the United States. And so you have all those things converge. And by the 1930s, particularly in New York, but it kind of emanates out from there, veal parm is basically entirely associated with Italian cuisine in America, which is really Italian American cuisine. So I found that linear story by rewriting it, and that was a tough process. But
well, there's an interesting timeline that I think you kind of articulated it throughout the book. Like, reading the book, it makes sense that World War II is this era where Americans really encounter and fall in love with Italian food, particularly something like, I guess, pasta carbonara. What can you kind of tell us about that era that was so important to Italian food as we know it today?
Well, so there were a couple of factors there. Number one, for Americans, it was really the exposure to a different type of cuisine. Millions of Americans went to Europe. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they were all eating Italian food. A lot of them did, but not all of them. But what it really did, it was open those soldiers up to different kinds of food experiences. They went from eating what mom cooked, which was probably what their grandmother cooked, to being forced to eat all sorts of different ethnic cuisines in Europe. And then technically a lot of them did end up eating things like pizza and spaghetti when they were in Italy. And then on top of that, the military itself was influential. So the U.S. military put together a field cookbook for their chefs, which included, I do like this, there was 2 ethnic foods, or what we would consider ethnic food, Italian-style meatballs, and they also had a Chinese-American noodle dish. And outside of that, it was mostly just Northern European foods that were not considered ethnic at the time, largely because Americans saw themselves as Northern European. And but in that field cookbook, it was these 2 dishes that were included, and I think that helped make soldiers more accepting of those foods. And so when they came back, they wanted them. They went out to Italian restaurants and they went out to Chinese restaurants. And the third element there is the rise of the convenience food craze of the 1950s, that a lot of emphasis was happening in the post-war suburban kitchen, where how do we make the homemaker's life easier? Right. And so, you have eventually the introduction of microwaves.
Appeal to the one who was going to the supermarket.
Exactly. And who's going to have to cook it, and who is going to have to deal with, and like all of that, house cleaning, even, caring for the exterior of the house, those were things that were like, we have tools to do this. We have dishwashers and home appliances, and so like sort of the tabletop appliance revolution was happening a little bit before that with the electric revolution. Like, the electricity allowed all sorts of things to be created. But before the war, you had the Depression, so not everyone was having access to these tabletop cheap electronics. After the war, you start getting more of that. And then on top of that, you have things like the frozen food. And that was a huge element for lasagna and pizza.
Well, that's what I was just about to ask you. It seems like you contend that, and in a lot of ways it makes total sense, that lasagna first became popularized in America through like kind of a frozen food option.
Yeah, so obviously Italian-American restaurants had some form of lasagna before the war, but in between 1945 and, so post-war and early 1950s, lasagna really becomes a much broader segment. And you can see that in what I call the women's magazines. Is this how the New York Public Library actually has this wonderful database of things like Reader's Digest they've put together as the women's magazine collection. And in that, multiple times, both lasagna and pizza have articles written about them, how to host a pizza party, how to make a lasagna. And included in that back then were pronunciation guides for both lasagna and pizza. Yeah, imagine a world where you don't know how to say pizza, right?
Wow.
And so it was really introducing women, particularly, to the idea of that. And like the idea of having a pizza party is great. You go to the store, you pick up the pizza, you bring it home, you have a sleepover with your friends, that sort of thing. And that speaks to that like movement towards convenience, takeout food, right? Pizza was very conducive to that. You put it in a box, you put it in your car, you drive to your little suburban house.
And it fed multiple people.
And it could feed multiple people, yeah.
Another chunk of the book deals with different types of pasta. Talk about the research. What goes into that tracking and identifying the roots of these different shapes?
So there is one book in particular, the Encyclopedia of Pasta, I'm going to mispronounce her name. It's a great resource. It's about 1,000 different pieces of pasta and the shapes and sort of the history. But in addition to that, there's also one of my favorite things available online, scanned by the trade organization, old copies of the New Macaroni Journal.
Wow, the New Macaroni Journal. What was this?
So the New Macaroni Journal was first published around 1919, and it was a trade publication for...
Tell me you've eBayed copies of these.
I have not physically held a copy of this, but they are electronically available as PDFs, and they're...
is this through the New York Public Library also?
No, this is literally from the organization that the macaroni... I forget the name of the organization. They're basically... there were so many manufacturers of macaroni and dried pasta in the early 20th century. They formed a trade organization to sort of promote both their product, help grocers sell it, become an avenue for advertisers to connect with grocers. So if you owned a grocery store, right, you might subscribe to this journal or maybe even get it for free. And you would learn about different kinds of macaroni, different ways of selling macaroni, different manufacturing processes. And they were a fascinating journal because they talked about all sorts of different pasta evolutions. The box, we all buy pasta in the box right now, right? That was a thing that was very new in the early 1920s. Before that, pasta, macaroni, dried macaroni, was sold basically by the barrel or crate. You would go to the grocer and you would say, I would like a pound of pasta. You would like 2 pounds of pasta. He would scoop it out with a giant scoop, put it into a bag for you, weigh it out, and you could buy as much or as little as you wanted. But in this New Macaroni Journal are advertisements for the first cardboard boxes. And so they're a fascinating element in the history of pasta because a lot of the legends that we think of with macaroni come from that. So I think a lot of people have heard that Marco Polo went to China and discovered pasta. This is not entirely true. It was mostly invented probably for the New Macaroni Journal because they had this whole section with tall tales. Again, they're trying to sell macaroni. So how do you make it interesting? How do you make it different and new? You create stories. And so one of the stories is about Marco Polo going to China, coming back to Italy and bringing pasta or macaroni with him. Italy definitely had macaroni before that. And different kinds of pasta. What he probably found in China, which was not something you had in Italy, were noodles that were made from things that were not durum wheat. So rice flour or other starches. I've seen, I think yam starch was used in a lot of cases, different grains generally, in part because they didn't have hard durum wheat as you had in Italy. And that's really where you get that nice tensile, the sponginess of pasta, that stretchiness, the gluten comes from durum wheat. And so anyway, it was one of the ways that the Macaroni Journal was creating tall tales.
But I mean, that's really interesting. And I think that probably a lot of common knowledge comes from inventions like this, inventions like the story of Marco Polo. And
so then it filters down into legend so that every school child in America will come and tell you Marco Polo invented spaghetti or from China, right? And obviously that is built on, and in a way, maybe even one of our famous dishes, spaghetti meatballs, has origins in this journal. So Rudy Valentino is a famous
singer
and movie.
Rudolph Valentino.
He died tragically of a weird disease in the 20s. Otherwise, he may have blown up even bigger. But he was a heartthrob, and the New Macaroni Journal published 2 of his favorite recipes, so they claim. the one is for spaghetti and tomato sauce, and the other is for meatballs, and they're published right next to each other.
This is like great celebrity fluff of the day, like the original.
Oh, absolutely.
What's this celebrity's favorite bowl of pasta?
Exactly. And then right around that same time, the American Beauty Macaroni Company begins advertising their spaghetti. And on the advertisement is a plate of spaghetti surrounded by meatballs, just like Lady and the Tramp is eating in 1955. So
great visuals there.
Yeah. And so it's right around there that we evolve from spaghetti without meatballs to having it being a very standard part of the experience. Whether we can say Rudy Valentino's recipe, or what they credit to him, is the reason. I think it's more that marketing was playing a big role in defining what that is, and marketing historically has played a huge role in defining Italian American cuisine, even to the idea of there being Italian cuisine generally, because remember, Italy was only united in 1861,
right?
And even in by 1880s, when the first waves of immigration are beginning, people didn't identify as Italian; they identified as Neapolitan or Roman or whatever town or region they came from. But in the early 20th century, to market products, people would market it as Italian product, and because it was impossible to have 40 different kinds of olive oils marketed.
Just simplified the packaging.
Yep. And so that really helped create Italian identity at that time. And this has been recurring throughout the 20th century of what is Italian American cuisine is what marketers have deemed it going into.
Totally. And that's being reinvented over and over today, especially by, these evil fast food brands that love to kind of appropriate Italian culture and Italian food.
My favorite one of those, which I didn't actually write about in the book, but very briefly, I believe it was Burger King, had a veal Parmesan sandwich.
I remember. Do you remember how I was asking someone if they remembered those terrible commercials where the guy walks in and he asks the person in Burger King where the gondola is? I was like, this is just terrible. This is just really bad. Something that, reading through the text, I was like, wow, this is going to strike people as a new way to look at the roots of Italian food or where it comes from. Tell us, what about Greece and North Africa? What was the connection there that you found?
Well, so Greece, in ancient Greece, before the Roman Empire, controlled parts of southern Italy called Magna Graecia, right? And so ancient Greeks have a big influence on that cuisine. And it's even possible that the word pizza is derivative of Greek pita, right? So when you get into linguistics, you go back and there's no definitive signs. There's other influences on that word and that type of bread, but that's one possible way. And so that's a really interesting way because that's really coming up. And then it was 2,500 years ago that this was happening, and that we still feel those effects. North Africa is an interesting influence because it has a big influence over Sicily. Sicily and Naples both go through many different periods of rule. So at one point, the Spanish are in there. Another point, the various Middle Eastern and North African, the Moors are crossing over into Sicily, and so macaroni is a big one that might come from not from North Africa, but it was essentially the ability to store flour, whether it's in the desert or on the ocean as a sailor. Flour doesn't store very well, but dried macaroni does. And Sicily was a great climate to grow wheat, and then more importantly, to dry out macaroni.
Right.
And so with these conquering cultures, when they controlled Sicily, a lot of it was, how do we extract value from this island? One way was dried macaroni. Another one was olives. I believe the Greeks actually were instrumental in planting olive trees in the south of Italy as well. And so all of these things are like the origins and the roots of Roman cuisine, which is the origins and roots of Italian cuisine, which is really the basis of Italian American cuisine. So,
Ian MacAllen, our guest today on Public Reading Club Red Sauce, is his book, How Italian Food Became American. Ian, I want to ask you, there's a lot of ideas in your book, and there's a lot of, there's so many contributions and different ways to analyze how things evolved. Was this book that we have here today, is this a historical book? How do you describe it when people want you to put it in that box that we're so often asked to put our work in?
I mean, I definitely think of it as a food history. I also wanted to find the stories that were not necessarily true and include them as this is what one theory is. It's probably not accurate, but you should know about it because, one, it's an interesting story, right? And two, if I don't mention it, then you think I've ignored it. And one of my favorites of that is carbonara, right? So very unclear origins, and even there's a more recent book, believe it or not, about the history of pasta that came out this past year by Luca Cesare, who talks about carbonara. And I was very happy to see that we don't really have any contradictions. He's a little bit more skeptical of some of the one of the claims by a chef who claims to have invented carbonara. But my favorite sort of myth with carbonara is there is a political organization, a secret society, essentially, called the Carbonari, who were involved in anti-fascist behavior. So they were really into ensuring the republic survived. And so one of the suggestions was that carbonara evolved from like their secret meetings, and it was a food they would serve at their clubhouses. I don't think that is accurate at all, 100%, but it's a really fascinating story of like this political group. And so I wanted to include that and just mention it's probably not true, but you should know about it just in case.
I think that this is something I'm really interested in, actually, as a writer myself and as a journalist. I think that stuff is so fascinating. I really, really believe that sometimes these stories that are not true or they're slightly true are things that people cling to sometimes in many ways, in good and bad ways. Like if you think about just even some local folklore or anything like that, I think that things don't necessarily have to be true to be A, believed, and then B, kind of interesting fodder for your brain, you know?
Well, I mean, the other thing with this is how sometimes these foods do enter into the ecosystem, right? So, and I think a really good example of this is amatriciana, which is one of the classic sauces of Rome. And so, speaking of carbonara, amatriciana is part of the same family of sauces. So you have cacio e pepe, which is pepper and cheese. You build on that and add bacon or pork jowl, and you have griglia. So, and then from that sort of base, you can either get carbonara by adding an egg or amatriciana by adding tomatoes. So amatriciana is not super popular in the United States in before the war. You probably could find it in Roman restaurants in America, but it wasn't widespread. By the post-war period, it was, and I say post-war period, but really it was 1952, 1953, that you probably could find it in a lot more red sauce joints, because what happened is the zoo in Rome had an elephant, and the poor elephant died. And the reason the elephant died is they would feed it spaghetti.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's tragic, but poor Remo loved his spaghetti amatriciana. And there was a news story about this elephant. It died right around Christmas. And you could see it in the wire services all across the United States for the next 6 weeks. it really, muddles your search results because it kept coming up for weeks afterward, and different newspapers, but same story, just repeated over and over again, and it was really that introduced Americans to amatriciana, and like, you read about this sauce, all of a sudden you want it, right?
Yeah, sure.
And like I said, you probably could find it on menus at restaurants, especially those that were Roman, but it was something that really became more widely available in that period, and I would suspect it's because poor Remo, the elephant in the Roman zoo. And so that's a way where, like, one of these stories has impacted life in in the real world.
One thing I wanted to ask you, and I don't quite remember how much of it is touched on in the book or how you personally feel about it, but what role does the mom and pop pizzeria have in the evolution of red sauce? It would appear to me that there's this world out there that kind of creates Italian American food, and then it's not actually kind of christened, if you will, until you see it in the mom and pop pizzeria, until the mom and pop pizzeria makes the mozzarella stick, until the mom and pop pizzeria makes fried raviolis, which we just had here down the street at TK's in Danbury for lunch. The question is, how do these places kind of go about co-signing these things that are kind of inventions?
Well, I think the important thing to realize is pizza as we know it today, ubiquitous in everything from the mall to the airport to your corner store. It wasn't always like that. 100 years ago, up until the 1920s, 1930s, you really only could get it in really limited Italian neighborhoods. Usually the local grocery or a bakery would have it. Lombardi's, the famous, the quote, first pizzeria in America, was really a grocery store that sold probably initially cold pizza.
Right.
And then from there, interestingly enough, all the early pizza makers in New York did time there, right? So Totonno's and Coney Island,
Sure.
Patsy's, John's. And then a little bit later, I guess concurrently in Trenton. I want to do a shout out to Trenton, New Jersey for having an old pizzeria as well.
And by the way, listeners, Totonno's in Coney Island is a clue as to one of our upcoming show guests. Go on.
All right. So, and then New Haven for sure. And then it sort of spreads after that. But, what changed, and this is where the mom and pop pizzeria comes in, is those were all coal-fired ovens, right? So you had a hard coal that you had to put into the oven, get it hot, keep it hot, and if you let it get cold for more than a day, it would take a couple days to get back up to temperature. After the war, Ira Nevin, avionics engineer from Westchester County, grew up the child of bricklayers. So his father and grandfather made ovens. And so he comes along, he makes the gas-fired pizza oven, which known as the Baker's Pride.
Yes, this is a revolutionary thing.
Oh, absolutely. And
I just want to mention that Capri Pizza in Bethel is the only pizzeria I know within driving distance of here, Western Connecticut State University, WXCI 91.7 studios, is Capri's Pizza that has the Baker's Pride. And listen, that's the best pizza around here.
So the Baker's Pride, poor Ira Nevin didn't patent the original version. So he gets a couple knockoffs, but it keeps him making more and more of these. And so at that point, that's when you start getting these neighborhood pizzerias, as depicted in all sorts of films. I'm blanking on what I was going to name, but where you, anyway. So
it's not Moonstruck, is it?
No, that was the one in Bed-Stuy. Anyway,
Do the Right Thing.
Do the Right Thing. There you go. Right, classic example of walking into a neighborhood pizzeria.
Yeah,
and particularly in New York, but in other cities on the East Coast, wherever the Italian Americans are, you get these mom and pop shops. Also, Chicago, similar type situations, although you're more likely to have more Italian deli. But in essence, all of these shops, or the good ones at least, will serve you an Italian hoagie, right? Or Italian submarine, Italian hero, depending. Grinder, if you're from New England.
Yeah, over here it's a grinder. I learned the hard way.
I can't believe I just said hoagie. That's
Pretty rough.
As a South Jersey thing, and so tip my hat to all my friends in South Jersey who've gotten me saying that instead of hero. And then a lot of the time they also have the classic red sauce menu, right? You can get pasta there. You can get most of the red sauce pasta sauces. You can get a chicken parm, a veal parm, meatball parm, and so in a way, a lot of them have prepared foods, and that is in a way a preservation of the classic red sauce joint. Like the red sauce joint is closing around the country, or it's going upscale. There are the few that are left, or the more modern ones tend to be upscale. Carbone is a very expensive place to eat. Don Angie, very expensive place to eat. You can't even get in, right? But you can go to your corner pizzeria and you can probably get spaghetti and meatballs, tortellini, Alfredo, whatever.
Like a lasagna.
Yeah, exactly. And so to me, they're both the preservationist of that red sauce tradition, and the ones who approve of it. And the interesting thing is how the confluence of different foods here. You go into a New York pizzeria, you probably can get a Jamaican beef patty, right?
Yeah.
A Jamaican beef patty with mozzarella cheese too.
And pepperoni the way I like it.
Oh yeah, there you go. And so that's the confluence of the different ethnic groups in New York coming together to improve food, right?
Yeah, oh definitely. And I can just for the sake of this conversation, while reading the book, I was brought back to my own days growing up in the Italian American community in New York City, and I had basically some relatives of mine had a pizzeria above which my grandmother and my aunt lived, and they actually resisted the temptation to serve anything but pizza probably until about 1994. Really, they didn't serve anything between 1969 and 1994 but pizza. So imagine thinking about that in today's terms where, again, and we're actually talking about like pizza with limited toppings, not the pizza that we talk about today. The pies, they would come out plain, nothing on it. And, there would be mushrooms, there would be pepperoni, there would be, different things that they put on the pies. But never did they serve a buffalo chicken slice or anything like that. Even after they started serving dishes, everything we've mentioned already, and pasta fazool and different things like that.
Well, I always think of the my hometown pizzeria. Shout out to El Palazzo.
Hi, El Palazzo.
These guys.
Enrico Palazzo.
Well, so these guys started out as a hot dog stand that they had bought, right? And so they served pizza there, and it was basically a shack that at some point, maybe I was 10 or 11, they started expanding it into truly the palace, as El Palazzo is translated to. And what they did is they built a formal dining room on one side, the casual pizzeria on the other side, and actually they had a ballroom upstairs and a ballroom in the basement, so you could rent out different size spaces if you wanted to have your wedding or your christening or whatever event. I think my 10-year high school reunion was in the ballroom.
Wow!
But
at the Palazzo,
yeah, classic red sauce place in the sense that you could get all of traditional veal parmesan, spaghetti and meatballs, but also adapting to modern times. They would get what has since been described today as northern or authentic Italian food, which I think I take issue with the term authentic, right? Authenticity is really whatever you're eating.
And it's totally in the eye of the beholder.
Exactly. And you go to Italy today and you say, I'm here for authentic Italian food, and you go eat at a place that has a cheeseburger. Is that authentic because it's being served in Italy, or is it inauthentic because you're having an American cheeseburger?
And I think burgers are originally from Germany, aren't they?
They're actually an invention in the United States with dubious ties to Germany. But yeah, so
dubious, to say the least. I love to investigate the dubious. And what are your favorite Italian foods that are largely American inventions?
I mean, I will always say yes to a good vodka sauce. Penne alla vodka, sure. I do love tortellini alla vodka, which is like really breaking the rules because you got a big stuffed pasta covered with a big creamy sauce. It's too much, but I love it.
I've had fettuccine, I guess I've had tortellini Alfredo.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, and that's the other thing is like a true Alfredo sauce is really just cheese and butter, which is spectacular. But an Americanized version of Alfredo sauce, like something you would get at the Olive Garden, or a variation of that. Actually, one of the early Americanized versions of this is from the Pennsylvania Dutch Noodle Company, trying to sell egg fettuccine. They have a recipe that is easier to make because essentially a true Alfredo sauce is an emulsion of a little bit of pasta water, a little bit of cheese, and a lot of cheese, and a lot of butter. And it's hard to keep it together if you don't know what you're doing, right? It might break if you have the wrong ratio. Whereas the moment you add something like cream or milk, which a lot of the more modern American recipes will have, it's easier to like not fall apart. And then also a lot of them will have a cheese, like a softer cheese that has like that stringy feel to it. So sometimes it's provolone, but it could just be a plain American cheese. It just has that melty quality. Mm-hmm. And so Americans really have made it more like a mac and cheese. But, it
really kind of is Italian mac and cheese.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
In its own way.
Yeah.
There's a story in the book about Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford's connection to fettuccine Alfredo. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Well, okay. So we should recognize that even though many Italians today will say Alfredo is nonsense, it's not Italian at all, it actually is. It was invented by a Roman chef in Rome. He created it initially to feed his sick wife who had just given birth and wasn't recovering fast enough. She wasn't gaining enough strength after birth. So what he did was he created the fresh pasta with heavy on the egg yolk, which is why it's golden in color. And he wanted to get more calories in her, but keep it easy on the stomach. So he added more butter, which is calorie rich, and more cheese, which is also calorie rich. That creates this very creamy, delicious sauce. She was the one who was like, this is great. You need to put it on the menu of your restaurant.
Wow.
And now this guy, the rest of his food was maybe not memorable, but he himself was very memorable. He had the nickname the Maestro because he would serve fettuccine Alfredo tableside with a string quartet.
Wow.
And, by tableside, I mean he would mix the pasta with the cheese and the butter right in front of you. And so he had kind of a reputation. It was kind of the kind of place where politicians and celebrities in Italy would go and get their eventually their photos would be taken. He had a whole wall of celebrity photos. And then in the 1920s, Pickford and Fairbanks get married. They're celebrity movie stars of the time. And they probably found out about this place from this restaurant writer who had come from a family of big showroom style restaurants where dinner and a show type places, but those had kind of shut down. So he had become a food writer, and he writes about Alfredos in Rome for the dinner and a show basically. and so they go there on the honeymoon, and the rumor is they ate there literally every night.
Wow.
I don't know if that's actually accurate or if it's modified over time, but they ate there a lot on their however long their honeymoon was, and they loved it so much they presented with a spoon and a giant serving spoon and fork that were gold plated. Wow. The Alfredo family claims they still have those and they display them. And so they're the ones who enjoyed Alfredo sauce so much, or pasta Alfredo. And then they would serve it at their dinner parties in Hollywood after that. That helped make it popular. And this is a classic like mid-century Italian American food. You go to a white tablecloth Italian restaurant in like 1955, and you would get an Alfredo dish served to you, and then it sort of gets cheaper after. It's cheapened by mass marketing after that.
Well, that's what I was just about to say to you. It's great that you actually bring that up, because personally, I love how you mention how many of these dishes kind of have the Olive Garden to thank in some ways, because I don't think many Americans would have even heard of some of these dishes, fettuccine Alfredo and the different things that they put out through their commercials that probably wasn't, it, in my opinion, wasn't very good when you went to get it at the Olive Garden, but it was something that, it was almost like free education on Italian food in some ways, because I'm not 100% sure, but I think as small pizzerias like the one that my relatives had for a while, as they evolved their menus, stuff like that was already familiar to a wider audience of people. Is that the kind of way you looked at it, or?
Well, I think we have to recognize that food evolves, right? The Italian-American food that I started writing about in Red Sauce in the book in 1900 is wildly different than where we're at now. And some of that is what happens when it's commodified. And while Olive Garden takes a basic Alfredo sauce and adds a bunch of things to it, and then you can get it with chicken and bacon and all these other things to make these monstrosities that are frankly delicious in a lot of cases, right? That's one evolution. On the other end, you also get fancier evolutions. And, I mentioned Don Angie, which is a upscale restaurant in New York. Can't get a reservation for. They've taken those classic red sauce menu items and upscaled them. They've reinvented them into a modern way, and that's continually happening. If you're not doing that, you don't really have a cuisine anymore. You have an old recipe, and and having looked at old recipes, an old recipe is not very useful or good, right? So some of the early recipes, you have to realize, people were cooking on open fires, right? We don't cook on open fires anymore,
no.
Right? And so the recipe is, you braise this for 5 hours on your open hearth. Make sure yeah. So we don't do that anymore. And so what does that look like today, where you turn on your gas or electric or induction stove and you have perfect temperature and perfect temperature control? You're not burning anything anymore unless you forget about it, right? And so just that is all different. And then access to ingredients, and that's a big part of the evolution of Italian-American food, is Italians who were coming in the 19th century and early 20th century were not ever eating meat in their lives. If they were lucky, they would get cut, side cuts or sausages, which are filled with the worst parts of an animal, right, a couple times a year. They come to America, they're eating meat 2, 3, 5 times a week.
And I always laugh when I hear the Italian steakhouse.
Yeah.
That's always kind of funny.
Well, the Italian steakhouse is fascinating because it's an embrace of that culture, right?
It's kind of the merging of
mm-hmm.
these two ideas, kind of the
bounty,
multi-course kind of Italian meal with the way we eat steak in this country. Ian MacAllen, author of Red Sauce, How Italian Food Became American, is in the WXCI studios here, 91.7 Danbury Radio. It is great to have Ian here. Ian, were there books about food that inspired you to write the book, and then were there books that inspired you as you wrote?
So, yeah, I remember one of the first books I bought, even before I was writing a book, it was just like, let me explore. I think it's We the Italians. It was basically more of a history of Italian Americans in America. It had a little bit of food, but it didn't have a lot. John Mariani's book, How Italian Food Conquered the World, is a great book and an amazing history of how Italian food as a whole category goes from the peninsula to not just the United States, but globally, right? Why we can get pizza in every country. And it's interesting. I was talking to him after the book came out. He graciously gave me a blurb on the back here. And he was saying, when he got the book, he was like, I already wrote this book. Wait, I didn't. It's a very different book, because we approach this from two different ideas. We're both talking about the history of Italian food, but I really am talking about the history of Italian American food. And he kind of includes Italian American food in the umbrella of Italian food and how that spread across the globe, whereas I'm really talking about how it evolved in the United States. And his book definitely was influential. Then what was I say? Andrew Smith, who's a food historian, he wrote a couple books on tomatoes, which are fascinating if you're really into like obscure tomato history and food histories. And so those were, to me, a lot of the sort of immediate influences. But, I read a lot of food books, right? Like I remember there's a book about cheeseburgers or hamburgers that I read when I was trying to conceptualize how to create the initial narrative. I'm reading about tacos now. I like food histories. I think they're really fascinating. Champagne. There was a great champagne book I read.
That's interesting.
So,
talk about finding a publisher for this book. What was the process like?
Well, so like I said, the first draft was written in a way that was like recipe based, not linear in time, and I did a round of queries, probably 20 or so agents. A couple of them asked for more. One of them just very graciously made some recommendations, and so that I went into the process of revising, and I started another round of queries after I had a whole new draft, and it was one of those moments where I'd sent out. I was going into July 4th weekend in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, and I sent out maybe early morning query letter to a couple agents, because it's a very draining process. It's like I used to compare it to online dating, where you're like, I think we're going to be perfect, and then they never get back to you, right?
Right. This is it.
Yeah, we're going to get married and have children, and then nothing happens. And so it's kind of like that with a book, right? Like you find an agent, you read everything you can about them, and you're like, they're going to be the perfect agent, and then they ghost you. But what happened is, like, a couple hours later, I got a call from Jonathan Agent, who's my agent. And he was like, this is really interesting. We have a conversation. He made some suggestions. He was like, why don't you send me the rest of it? And we went back and forth for a little bit, and then he started pitching it out. I don't know the process after his end of it. I do know, so that was July. The problem with book publishing is it takes so long, right? So I did a round of edits, and then he wanted to get out before sort of like the cutoff in November. So by the end of the year, book publishers are looking to wrap up ongoing projects, and then we'll start again in the new year. So no one wants to query in November, December. And and then finally I said, he mentioned that an editor was interested and that we were talking about what that would look like. And then my son was born, and a couple hours later I got the contract, and that's how that went. There was, as a first-time author, you don't have much to talk about in terms of negotiating or anything. It's not like you're Stephen King, where you're like, I can guarantee that 1 million books are going to sell, and what are you going to give me in return? It's more like, great, we're going to have a partnership that is mostly, me providing a book and you providing publishing and
other services.
Other services that go along with that, and publicity and things like that. So, yeah.
We met in a bar a while back. Not the first time we met, but we had a few drinks around Christmas time. And you said you spoke to a publisher or maybe an agent who said that because you worked in design primarily, that you weren't really a writer. Or how did you feel about that? What was that story?
Yeah. So, being in New York and being an aspiring writer, I have known agents, I've known editors, and a lot of some of my friends who are agents have said, they talk about platform and what that looks like, and platform can be 1 million Instagram followers, but it can also be writing bylines about a certain topic, or in my case now, because I've now written a book about food. My agent's like, I want you, you should write more food books, because it's easier to pitch you as someone who's written about food because you've already written about food. If I wanted to write about another topic, I would basically be starting from the beginning again. And so that is one of the challenges of writing any type of book or any topic of a book, is you can get pigeonholed into a specific type of genre or area of expertise. And obviously from the perspective of everyone who's not writing the book, the publisher, the editor, the agent, they're looking at it as a product that they can sell, whether it's selling to an editor or an editor selling to a publisher or a publisher selling to the general public. And then, even after you've sold it, you have to convince a bookstore owner, a bookstore clerk to put it in the bookstore, or a librarian to put it in the library. And so everyone's looking at it from that perspective, not necessarily of what is going to be a great story, but what is going to be a product that can sell. And so having some kind of platform, and that can be all sorts of things. That can be a network of friends. It can be a network of bylines that you've written on a topic. That all plays into how a book or a book project is seen as viable, right?
You're also a book critic. What drew you into that type of writing?
I will say 14, 15 years ago, before I had applied to graduate school, I had not majored in English. And I was a couple years out of college, so I knew I needed letters of recommendation. So I took a class at Rutgers Newark. It was an English lit class. And I was up front with the professor at the beginning. I said, look, I want to apply to the Master's in English program. I'm going to, if I do well, I want a letter of recommendation. And I really loved that class. It was Rigoberto Gonzalez, who I believe now is the director of the Rutgers Newark MFA program. And, the class was this amazing class on what he called the post 9/11 working class novel. So we had 5 or 6 novels from writers who were talking about class issues through the working class lens, but after 2001. So it was a very last 10-year kind of thing. But what he said early on in that class was he talked about how critiquing work is a great way of understanding your own work. And then also he was someone who come up at a time when newspapers would pay people to review books. So writing book reviews was a good way of sustaining your own writing. So it was a double-edged sword where you both were becoming a better writer and then also sustaining yourself financially. The financial part is less true now.
Yeah, you could say that again.
Yeah. But I realized it was a great way to expand my own understanding of how books were constructed and, build up networks of editors. At this point now, I do a lot of book reviews, the Chicago Review of Books, among other places. But I think I've gone through 3 or 4 editors there. And, and one of the editors, this woman, Amy Brady, has her book coming out in the summer this year, Ice, the history of cocktails and other things. And it's a fascinating look. In the same way I'm writing about Italian food, she's writing about the history of ice, which is a very American type of thing. And so I'm going to interview her about her book because and that's how you build that network, right? You don't do that just by being like, I'm going to write a book and then someone's going to interview me, right? You build on those relationships. And so,
how did the value of a book review or a critique change when you became a first-time author?
To see other people writing about your work or talking to you about your work is absolutely phenomenal. And then it's when you're putting something out there, you really have no control over how it's going to be received. And as I found out, it's very hard to get any kind of traction, right? Even when you communicate with booksellers, I would like to do an event. We don't have time, or you have to get in there. So to have someone say, I'm reviewing this book is phenomenal. To have someone talking to you about having this conversation now is great because, if you're talking about getting people interested in your work, it's the only way to really do that is to have press and publicity, and it's very hard to do. And even publishers are, the publicist at your publisher will do, what they can, but they have hundreds of books in a year that they're promoting. So even then, you're kind of like putting yourself out there without a whole lot of superstructure behind you. And so you're doing your best to get people interested. And so when people are interested, it's really a good feeling.
Let me ask you something. As a reader, as a writer, you got and I don't know why I'm asking this. I guess I want to ask somebody else about it. But you got fairly good reviews on Goodreads. It seems like people mostly like the book. Let me ask you, how do you feel about something like Goodreads? Is it something that you really feel kind of enhances writing, or is it something that just feels like Yelp?
So for me, I personally had used Goodreads for a long time just to track what books I was reading. Now, I will occasionally now give a book a 5-star because I know some people do worry about that, whether it's a publisher or just booksellers. And one of the best gifts you can give a writer is giving them a high regarding review, whether it's a 5-star or 4-star, and writing something meaningful about it on a place like Amazon or Goodreads, because that does sell books, right? And then you also get some that are, my favorite 1-star review was, I really wanted to like this book, but it's all filler. The back quarter of it or back third of it is all these notes, the citations. And all I could think of is, yes, I have citations because I backed up my research, right? This is a research book, and I want you to know that it's not just fiction. It's not the Marco Polo story.
What types of books are your favorite to review?
I have been exploring sort of a niche of short story collections because they often don't get the attention from a lot of other reviewers. So I like being the person who gets to review a short story collection, and I particularly like short story collections that deal in sort of the slight science fiction, sort of the alternate speculative worlds of the future, where we collide with technology, where we collide with the existential threat of what the future is, and that can manifest in all sorts of different ways. But when I come across those collections, I think those are some of my favorite.
Who are the writers? This is something I always wanted to ask a book reviewer and somebody who's a critic of books. Who are the writers that you're excited about? I mean, even if you don't actually physically do it, who do you pre-order in your mind?
I often try to pre-order the books of people I know in real life. I'm thinking of Tracy O'Neill. I think she has a new book. It may not be for pre-order yet, but she announced that recently. Alexandra Kleeman, who I think she's on her third or fourth book, and that was her last book came out in the middle of the pandemic, and that was one where I went to the bookstore to ask that they get it, and so these are people I've met through being in the New York City literary community, and those are the kinds of books that I'm really excited to pre-order ahead of time. And then you feel guilty if you see someone in real life and you didn't buy their book.
How often do you not finish a book?
So traditionally, if I get in, 25 to 30 pages, I will get through the rest of the book. More recently, since having a child, I have a stack of books where I've read 10 pages, and then something happens that is like a baby crying, baby needs milk, baby needs diaper change, and so my overall reading consumption has left me a pile of books that in 18 years I'm sure I'll be able to get to.
Tell us what's next for you, Ian. What's the plan now?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm working on
day by day.
Yeah, day by day. I'm working on another book project, food history related. I'm hoping to get that moving forward in a really meaningful way. I have some words down, but all of these things are a process. And then you think you've written one book, and that is the map, but the next book is always different. So even though you feel like you've gotten sort of an understanding of how to do this, it's a totally different experience. And then the other thing is, the most recent thing that I did on Red Sauce, right? I had a full manuscript and I was making edits, and I literally the last thing I did was I put together the index. It was like the right before it went to press, right? But I was working with a book of 50, 60, however many thousands of words it is, and and it has weight. It's a weighty file that you open up.
It's dense.
And you look at the word count in Microsoft Word, and you're like, I have a book, right? When you're starting over from the beginning, you're always like 0 words, 5 words, 10 words,
right.
and so you're literally starting from nothing again, and it's a dispiriting feeling to be like, I have nothing, right? And then you have, you gradually go up, and I've said now, and I think the first 10,000 words are the easiest, the last 10,000 words are the easiest, and the middle thousands, those are the hardest. And you can get bogged down, and you get bogged down in stupid things like, you're doing research and you're looking at, something totally unrelated. Somehow you go from reading about food to trains in Tokyo, or, some new hotel in Europe, or, and, so those tangents really like are distraction, and then real life distraction.
Well, it's as a writer, I think it's your interests and your curiosity are everything. If you can follow those things and turn it into a good article or a good book, I think you're doing the job that you're supposed to do. And I think it's one of those things that just keeps evolving. How long did it take you to write this book?
I think I would say the first from being drunk at dinner to the first draft was about 3 years, 2.5 years.
Wow.
And then there was a whole nother year of another rewrite, and then another year. There's waiting once you get a publisher who's interested. There's waiting for them to read what you've sent them, and then they give you a little bit of time to do some edits and revision, and so there's doing that. But there's a lot of waiting to hear back from agents, a lot of waiting to hear back from editors, and it's like silence. So how do you fill that time? For me, it's a lot of reading, trying to write, trying to come up with ideas for other things. And so you do space it out. It's not, and that's the thing to remember. Writing a book is you can't do it in a day. You probably aren't going to do it in a week. Yeah, I think I read Bridges of Madison County was written in 6 weeks. But
wow.
But that's like one of those things that's not real. Like, he wrote a draft in 6 weeks, but how long did it take to go from a draft to
right?
And from draft to best picture or whatever it was, or it's many years, right? And so that's what you always have to really internalize. Is like, it is time, and what it really is for writing a book or even a short story is it's not about sitting down and finishing it. It's about sitting down every day and doing a little bit, and after a month you have a lot,
right?
And after a year you have a book, right? And that's really the thought that you have to keep in mind.
The book is Red Sauce: How Italian Food Became American. The author is Ian MacAllen. He was our guest here today on Public Reading Club. Ian, thank you so much for coming to the WXCI studios here in Danbury, Connecticut. This was one of our best conversations. I really do think that not only did we touch on a lot of fun stuff, but I think a lot of people who listen to the show, and I'm sure some people in our MFA in creative and professional writing program will be interested in reading, as well as Layla, who introduced us. That was so. What Matt's referencing here is early on. We worked together on a project I was involved with, and Ian's just a fantastic writer. Really one of the best I ever had any type of professional one-on-one with. So Ian, thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
What kind of help does the IRS have for identity theft victims?
If you suspect you're a victim of tax-related identity theft, go to irs.gov/identity theft to learn how to prevent potential refund fraud and protect your tax account. At the IRS, combating tax-related identity theft is a top priority, and we are committed to prevention, detection, and assisting victims. And we're working with law enforcement to catch the criminals. For more info, go to irs.gov/identity theft to learn what the IRS is doing to help protect you.
Joining us now on Public Reading Club on WXCI 91.7 Danbury Radio from Western Connecticut State University is an esteemed alumnus of this institution and a fantastic writer who I've gotten to know not only as a teacher, but as somebody who's kept up with a lot of his work and his articles. And there was definitely some excitement in the studio today when I spoke to our engineer, Pat Fournette, who's here, about Erik Ofgang's article that recently was released in the Smithsonian. Erik is a alumnus of WestConn, as I said. He teaches part-time here, but he's also a really prolific journalist who's written for the Washington Post, the Associated Press, obviously the Hartford Courant. He worked as at a staff position at Connecticut Magazine, and he does a lot of great freelance work, and he does some writing for Tech and Learning magazine in a full-time position. He's one of everybody in the WestConn MFA program's favorite teachers and personalities. Erik Ofgang, fantastic writer, is here. Erik, it's nice to have you actually in here.
Very nice to be here, and thank you for that introduction. I think even my mom is going to be like, that. Some of that stuff is over the top.
It's all true, though, which is the crazy thing, you know. Erik, you had the really fantastic kind of task. Yeah, I'm sure you pitched it in a freelance capacity to write an article for Smithsonian Magazine about Mr. Electrico, who was allegedly a magician who, in short, inspired Ray Bradbury, the prolific science fiction author and writer. Is that the long and the short of it?
Yeah.
Nothing wrong there with that. Yeah,
all right, yeah.
So tell us what. One of the things that I really wanted to do with the show, and I'm so glad it's Erik Ofgang, that's the first person, is I also wanted to open a public reading club to really good articles. I don't think really good articles get enough recognition and use, and the truth is, moviegoers should know many of your favorite movies started out as magazine articles. Argo is one of my favorite magazine articles. We learned on the Public Reading Club last week that Saturday Night Fever was based on a magazine article that was largely fabricated.
And then even Fast and the Furious, I think, was based
there
on
was
the original.
Yes.
Yeah. Based
very loosely based on a magazine article, and this has gone on for quite some time. I roughly experienced something like that once with a newspaper article that I wrote. I got to the early stages of it, but I wanted to open up the show to people who just wrote fantastic articles that weren't books. Probably could be a book in this case, I think. Tell me a little bit about how you found this Mr. Electrico character and what made you go after it to write a story about it.
So 2 things for background. I'm a big science fiction fan. I'm also a magician.
Yes.
So I always, I love magic and I love science fiction. I love Ray Bradbury. And it was in the summer of 2020, during maybe late spring, like during the thick of the lockdown, nothing was going on. No one was doing anything. Just kind of a depressing, strange, eerie Twilight Zone time, tragic time. I was reading, at home on the weekend, reading Ray Bradbury's Zen and the Art of Writing, which I had read from in the past. And I came across, one version of his story of meeting Mr. Electrico as a kid. And he says after his uncle's funeral, he runs out to this visiting sideshow and he sees this spectacular performance where the guy is getting shocked by 50,000 volts of electricity and sparks are firing from his fingers, and he commands young Bradbury to, quote, live forever. He touches him with this electrified sword, and it has this profound impact on him. And it really started as just this, as I wrote in the article, I was like, oh, wow, that sounds like an amazing act. I wonder if there's some YouTube footage of that. And from that simple, as soon as I Googled it, it turns out that no, there isn't any YouTube footage, and there's no real concrete evidence that Mr. Electrical ever existed, despite the fact that many people have tried to find him, many Bradbury scholars, because like me, they were touched by the story and wanted to find this performer. So that was the start of it, and it just kind of I got kind of obsessed with it from there. I decided, for no particular reason, but that because I'm a journalist and I'm a magician, that I was uniquely qualified to look into this. I am not. I might have been uniquely interested.
Have there have been people that said they actually saw him.
There have not been, to my knowledge, a single corroborating report.
So we're talking about the Bigfoot of magicians here.
Yeah, and they refer to it as, the Holy Grail of sideshow history. Now, as I dug into it, though, however, I found that there was, the way Bradbury describes the act is so vivid and so amazing that it almost sounds kind of undoable. It sounds, larger than life. Like, I've never seen an act like that. But I did find evidence, and quite a bit, that these acts were quite common. They were mostly, and this had been sort of seen on the, this wasn't like a, people knew this, but there wasn't a lot of connection between the sort of Bradbury scholarship world and the sideshow circus historians. So I was able to sort of bring the story together between those two worlds, and the acts were common. It was almost it was a sideshow staple. It usually featured a woman.
And this is the electric chair.
Yeah. They would get strapped into an electric chair. They'd be shocked full of electricity, and then they would light light bulbs with their hands or, shock people. And it varied somewhat, but it was a standard. The electric chair act was a standard part of touring sideshows. And I would kind of look into it off and on. And then I think I was watching the original version of Nightmare Alley, and then I was just like, oh, wow, there's a Miss Electricia in the movie, in doing that act, and so the fact that there was, I found a number of women performers going by Miss Electricia. It hit me that Mr. Electrico is kind of just the male version of that.
Well, it's like a hodgepodge.
Yeah.
Of the thing. What I wanted to ask you is, for index purposes, is there stuff you could point to directly in Bradbury's work that was influenced by this?
So when he met Mr. Electrico after the performance, Mr. Electrico, as part of the Bradbury story, supposedly introduces him to the sideshow's tattooed man or illustrated man, other characters from the sideshow, and the illustrated man, is a central character in one of Ray Bradbury's collections called The Illustrated Man, which is a great collection of short stories. There's a character named Mr. Electrico in Something Wicked This Way Comes, and it's kind of this dark traveling circus that comes to town and, is kind of stealing town people's souls. And, in that he's recast as a villain. But you can see a tremendous influence of this sideshow circus world in his writing.
How much of this was like kind of perpetuated by Bradbury himself after a while? How long did he keep it up,
It's funny. One of my friends who I talked in the story, talked with, and who helped me kind of trace the history of this act, a folklorist out of UMass, Stephen Jangarella, says, there's something that occurs where it's myth-making for yourself, where you have your own kind of mythology and your own personal folklore. And, I think that definitely was playing into this. This was a part of his origin story. And I think it may have changed with time, but I do think at the same time there was, an essential truth there. I think he did see an act like this. And as I researched it, a lot of the elements of the act, it had almost, it was this kind of almost pseudo-spiritual experience for young Bradbury. And that was a common component of these electricity acts, because they would often have sort of a medicine show or even a healing component.
I think it's kind of interesting because myself, I had this crazy experience in the early or kind of mid-'90s there. We went to Florida as a family, and I don't know what my father was thinking or it was a good idea or not. But we went to go see somebody wrestle an alligator. And it was really just a ridiculous type of stunt. The guy was just... Unfortunately, the gator looked kind of sedated, and maybe the guy was just kind of poking it with a stick. But I remember it so vividly. And yet, it's almost impossible to Google where I was. I can remember names being called out on the PA system and stuff. But I think it's these things that stick with you as a writer. Do you have weird things like that happen to you as a writer, even if you don't want to get too deep into it for obvious reasons, but that kind of stick with you and you always want to do something with it creatively?
There's places definitely that you go to, performances that you see that have an impact. I saw a magician named Jeff McBride when I was a kid, and he was just, this amazing magician who did a lot of sleight of hand and card stuff, not like big illusions. I loved that. I remember also seeing as a kid the human cannonball at a circus that was like coming through the town, and that part, I didn't care about the animals or the clowns or anything, but like the fact that the guy got into a cannon and launched himself across the tent was, that seemed crazy to me. So that stood out. I haven't, ever written about it, but I like that world. Certainly a lot of things, different places you go are also so rich. I remember going to Coney Island. I had grown up hearing about it from my dad and grandfather and hadn't been there until I was probably a teenager. And it just was, such a wacky place. You could tell it had, it was not as big as it once had been. And this was a little bit, I think, before the revival it's seen. But there was a guy like on the corner being like, shoot a live human being and not get arrested. Step right up and like you could pay. And it was basically you paid to shoot a guy with a paintball gun, which seemed not really appealing to me, but was also kind of like a very Coney Island-esque thing. And that always stuck with me.
It's interesting that you said in the story that Bradbury himself wasn't always the most reliable narrator because, recently the movie Marlowe came out, and I think I got really interested in Raymond Chandler, and it seemed like there were a lot of things in his life that he himself made up or kind of embellished or perpetuated kind of for a very long time. How much of that did you find when you were looking into Bradbury?
So it seemed like he would condense stories and condense timing. One of the things that came up that another researcher had found before me with Mr. Electrical is that he always said it had happened on, a weekend in September, and it happened after his uncle's death. Well, his uncle didn't die till October. His uncle was murdered in October. So the dates, were off, and that could be verified. And there's no record of a circus visiting his town in that late October period. So there was definitely things like that. I don't think Bradbury was even conscious of it. I think it was kind of the way, when you have like a relative or a friend who's a good storyteller and, maybe you've been with them and they tell the story and you're like, well, that's a better version of what happened. Right. It's not exactly, they're exaggerating here and there. It's a central truth versus, I guess, that literal truth. And as a journalist, obviously, we want that literal truth where we have to verify that it happened, not something like that, that this actually happened.
How about writing a piece like this? I mean, when I think just to talk, maybe kind of to speak to some of the writers out there, and I always try and tell writers, recently spoke at a college, a couple of different colleges, and some of the students were curious about maybe podcasting or maybe doing a series of articles, but I told them do something that could be complete. You know what I mean? So to complete this article, something that was based on stuff that happened, I mean, are we talking 90 years ago? These events might have taken place 80 or 90 years ago. What do you do in terms of a writer today to kind of even if there's a young writer out there who's like, hey, I have a great idea for an article. I don't know who I would interview for it to gather facts. I mean, what were the first thoughts that came through your head? Obviously, you've been doing this a long time, but
there's
teaching moment.
Yeah. There's a couple things. I mean, I think the biggest thing for me with this type of story was realizing that like I could tell it, that I didn't have to be afraid of telling a big story. This one actually, I had some, I think, argument for why I should be the one to tell it, but I think that was a big thing for me. So that just kind of that idea that like oh, I'm a local journalist or I'm this type of journalist, I can't take this story on. I think you can, so anyone can. Then, to get more concrete beyond that, you often start with the people who have already done the research. You're looking, that's part of finding both what you need to find for the story and, what your angle might be. If I had Googled this and found out that, it was a big mystery for 20 years and someone found Mr. Electrico, that might have been the end of the story. So it was reaching out to people who had looked into it. I mentioned I reached out to a friend of mine who is really good at researching these kind of things and asked him if he had any ideas, and he put me on to this, other magician who had predated Mr. Electrical. So that kind of, talking to the experts and then sort of looking beyond that too. I subscribe to a couple different newspaper databases. One of them is newspapers.com, and that gives you, a real good starting point for history stories. You could search terms and quickly find things. It was a little trickier in this case because I had to find access to Billboard magazine, which was the big entertainment industry magazine of the day. And that was where the information about a lot of these acts, the most information about a lot of these acts were.
About these live kind of sideshow acts.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's not a place. Erik Ofgang with us on WXCI 91.7, Danbury, Connecticut. Before I let you go, Erik, when you look at something like this, you've already done the work. There's kind of a two-pronged question. First part is, as a writer and a writing teacher, and something that I even as a student here myself, I've maybe tried to encourage some of the other students with, is like, if you know something like magic, if you know something like bartending, if you know something like perhaps DJing, like young Patrick here knows, this is the place to start your writing career if you're interested in writing, unless I'm not thinking of it the right way.
So, I 100% agree. I think there's something, and that's actually something I didn't realize for a while. I think I thought, like, if
Had to be separate, right?
Yeah, I'm too close to it. I shouldn't, I shouldn't, almost like kind of like I can't cover magic because I'm a magician, and that would be a conflict of interest. It wouldn't be, but, that kind of thinking where it's, I agree. I think you should look for, the stories that you're uniquely qualified to tell. The flip side of that, which is almost kind of that I also think is true, is sometimes you just have a story idea and you're not the person to tell it at all, but that's kind of the beautiful thing about journalism, where you could become that person through the research and through the process of reporting it. So I think you could be open to that possibility too.
You shouldn't shy away from things, but at the same time, like, a great way to get going is to start with stuff that subject matter that you know.
Yeah, and the other thing, my friend and an editor I still work with at Tech and Learning Magazine, Ray Bradbury, always says is that a lot of times a big problem he sees with writers is that they'll come with stories that there's someone theoretically out there wants to read, and it's like, it's not me or you, but someone will want to read this story, and it sounds simple, but it really does have to be a story you would want to read.
Right.
And that's what, with this Mr. Electrical story, it was a tough sell because it's a quirky, odd story. But I sort of trusted. I was like, I'm so interested in this. There's going to be other people. It's not going to be.
I thought it was really provocative story, and I think I'm. I say this on every show. I go to the movies every week, and I am very interested now more than ever. Not even as a writer, just as a consumer, someone who eats this media weekly, daily at times. Where do these stories come from? Last night I saw Operation Fortune with, Jason Statham and these other people, Carrie Elways, and, I guess it was just an original screenplay. But I was kind of wondering, I was like, is this some old British spy movie that I never heard of? I'm very interested in that. And a week before that, it was Cocaine Bear. You know what I mean? So this Mr. Electrico, to me, again, just the way that Hollywood takes things, and just the way that I think a lot of good novelists, this might be a great novel for somebody to write, like the Mr. Electrico novel that you could, a great writer named Jerry Stahl, who wrote Permanent Midnight and many other books, and screenplays and stuff. He wrote a book that kind of fictionalized the life of Fatty Arbuckle.
Yep. Yeah. No, I agree. And if there's any Hollywood producers listening, I'm open to
Exactly.
calls.
What's your cell number?
Yeah. I think Jason Momoa would be a natural to play me.
Right,
Exactly. That's what everyone's always saying. I don't really see it, but people are just telling me that.
Oh my God, it's pretty much. I do think that stories like yours, it could make a great book. It could make a great movie or anything like that. But in addition to everything that Erik does, he teaches and all this other stuff. But before we let you go, anything you're working on that you want to mention that's in the works, or?
I've got a couple things. I'm doing a lot as we were talking, as we were walking in. I'm doing a lot of stories about Chat GPT, which is something that I've been focusing a lot on its implications for education, which it has a lot of. But I think it has the potential to change society, not necessarily for the better, possibly for the better. And it's it's just this intriguing world. There's a group of people I started following on Twitter for research purposes that are fully convinced that AI has sentience, and it's not something I've yet figured out how I'm going to approach, but I'm curious by that, and I don't agree with that assessment, by the way, but I'm fascinated by it.
Well, you know what it is. It's just we're in an era where this type of advancing technology is so ubiquitous, and it's like it's kind of being produced every day, and I'm not necessarily scared of it, but I don't necessarily. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I think I'm still going to write no matter what happens with that.
Well, yeah, I don't think it will ever, at least not in the foreseeable future, be a threat to any of the kind of writing we're talking about on this show, where it's deep and from the heart and things like that. I think some of the clickbait, SEO-friendly stuff that's out there, it might threaten a few of the content marketing typewriters eventually,
The very last interesting nugget we're going to let you wrap about, because we do have to sign off right now, but thanks so much for coming. You're teaching a beer making class, or history of beer?
A history of beer class. Yeah, I'm going to be teaching that at University of Hartford. It's going to be 3 sessions. I'm actually teaching it with my friend who I mentioned, Stephen Jancarella, who teaches a class at UMass called The Folklore of History. And it's just going to be going into the origins of beer and the ancient world, and then also just right up through modern times, and also colonial Connecticut. I was doing some research for it recently, and someone in New Haven who was accused of witchcraft, what she was accused of was spoiling one of the early residents of New Haven's beer.
Wow, that's pretty cool. I mean, I'm gonna have to try and sneak into the class or get the cliff notes from somebody, but. Erik Ofgang, really had so much fun checking out your article in the Smithsonian about Mr. Electrico. You will be back on the show when your next book comes out. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to go very quickly into our book recommendations that was submitted by a gentleman named Eugene Kehoe. I'm not quite sure where he got my phone number. I think it was written on the bathroom wall at Danbury Arena, and that is how I've gotten his book recommendations. But this was submitted to us by a gentleman named Eugene Kehoe. Eugene, thank you for your book recommendation. Keep them coming to the Public Reading Club. Send us book recommendations via DM on Instagram, thepublicreadingclub@gmail.com, or you could also find us on Facebook. And thanks so much. Thank you, Eugene.
Oh, this is Eugene. I like to read. I guess what I'm reading right now is fiction, the John Grisham Sparring Partners. It's a book about lawyers and sparring. It's not boxing. It's about lawyers, and it's 3 novellas. I mean, it's all right. It's better than a Rooster Bar, which I just walked out of. Happy St. Patrick's Day, WXCI. So this book's three short stories. One's Jacob Bergantz, who has Time to Kill fame, first story that John Grisham ever came out of. The next one's about some guy on death row, which I'm probably going to be on. And then the third one is a lawyer versus a lawyer. Not much to really go into there, but yeah, it's all right. But my recommendation on sparring partners, I'd say that's 4 out of 6 bottles. Give them more or less. I really thought, well, this is Eugene. I gotta go. Fixing to find a bathroom around here somewhere. But keep it cool, WXCI. Bye.
Public Reading Club is a production of WXCI 91.7 Danbury Radio, hosted by Matt Caputo and produced by Pat Frenette and Matt Caputo.